Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with a great academic. My name is Josef Mühlbauer. I work as a university assistant at the University of Graz. I'm also a scientific researcher at Empowerment for Peace. And today I have the great honor and privilege to introduce to you Immanuel Ness. Professor Immanuel Ness focuses on political economy of comparative labor movements, workers' social organization. He is an expert on migration, the global south, and also on contemporary imperialism. He published numerous monumental and important anthologies and books and is a leading intellectual in the field of imperialism. So, dear Professor Ness, I thank you very much for taking the time for this interview.
My pleasure. Thank you, Joseph.
We live in times of climate crisis. We live in times of militarism, in times of poverty, and also hunger, genocide. We have more than 50 conflicts. And I want to bring all this into a perspective, and maybe we can analyze a bigger picture if there is any bigger picture. And maybe one of the explanations for what is going on, geopolitical tensions that I mentioned, ongoing conflicts around the world, and militarization, maybe is imperialism. So let's dig deeper into the how do you define imperialism? Is it the right tool in your opinion and the right concept in order to understand the situation, the global situation nowadays?
Thanks for that question. Most scholars, mainstream scholars and beyond, do recognize imperialism, only they use a different nomenclature that is based on global hegemony, the struggle amongst powers in the world that have emerged in succession under capitalism to gain hegemonic control over the world. And so in the last round, the period right around the Second World War, the United Kingdom was replaced by the United States as the great power of the world because it had a monopoly of the uh, military might, economic might, amongst other characteristics that would apply. And also it tried to promote its political perspective around the world. And it was just after the Second World War that the United States began to expand its influence um, after decolonization took place, during and after. It began to expand its influence throughout the world, including parts of what was then known as the Third World, poor countries of the world that were gaining independence. And it also maintained control over the dynamics of the entire world, really, with the exception of the Soviet Union to some extent. However, even then, the Soviet Union was not a peer competitor by any stretch of the imagination. It's sort of ironic that people argue that the Soviet Union was defeated in 1990, or it collapsed, or it came to an end in 1990, and that augured a new era of U.S. hegemony. Well, I think it did in a certain way, but I don't think it was the primary force that contributed to U.S. global hegemony. It was actually the U.S. Control over uh, military economic power that was able to propel it into the position of global hegemon. And of course, like I said, one can read the mainstream literature and it sort of concurs on many of these same questions. And the big question would be, from a mainstream perspective, that the great landmass, Eurasia, is the most important of the world. If you read the work of Zbigniew Brzezinski, Mackinder, and others, and that whoever controls Eurasia will control the world. Well, of course, Britain was able to control the world without controlling Eurasia because it dominated the seas. And it came to an end around the 1920s, 30s, because it was superseded by the United States, which really was not threatened in any way by other global imperialist powers. Now, I think the concept of imperialism emerges in the early 20th century with an analytic perspective that was advanced by Vladimir Lenin in his very important work, Imperialism, the Latest Stage of Capitalism. Many people I guess, misrepresent the book in the sense that they use the title Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism. But in fact, it is the most recent stage in the sense that Lenin did not prefigure what would happen in the future. It was an analysis of imperialism at that specific time. And of course, there was what is referred to as inter-imperialist rivalries amongst the capitalist countries of the world. And, they included Britain, France, Germany, and the United States and beyond. So in Lenin's really prescient work, he makes the very important case that I think applies today, that it is through the capacity of uh, very advanced states to develop their economies through exporting finance capital throughout the world. And in the context of Lenin's book, he examines Germany as the primary force in terms of its domination over Russia because of the cheap labor supply that was available in Russia relative to Germany. And that as a consequence, he uses a perspective that is rooted in a dialectic that is based on class struggle, that the class struggles of Germany contributed to a more advanced working class, as was the case in Britain and other more advanced capitalist economies. We should remember that Russia in the early 20th century was emerging from feudalism after 1860s, 70s, and so forth. And it was largely an agrarian economy, semi-feudal agrarian economy. And the fact that there was a surplus of labor uh, allowed Germany and other imperialist powers to invest in the labor of those countries and to extract surplus value through the wide availability of cheap labor. So that's the primary perspective that is advanced by Lenin in his epic work, which I would argue in many ways is still applicable today for a number of reasons. So I would probably situate imperialism uh, within the context of economic uh, domination over other countries, because it's through economic domination of other countries that the benefits accrue to the uh, advanced countries of the world. And in this context, we see what Argyri Immanuel had put forward in his 1969 book, Unequal Exchange, which is now being reissued by Monthly Review Press, where he examines the actual value of labor and its production in global South countries, poor countries of the world, and how rich countries are able to take advantage of poor countries through investing in those economies in a certain way that they can extract surplus. In some ways, they don't invest at all, but they're extracting surplus so that notwithstanding purchasing price parity and so forth, that the degree to which there is an extraction of value is, monumental compared to the capacity to extract surplus in the advanced capitalist world.
Absolutely interesting analysis. maybe you allow me to play devil's advocate. For many liberals and or mainstream scholars, for example, there is no U.S. imperialism, and they, argue that we are building bridges. Yes, maybe our companies control most of the revenue and dominate the market, and yes, we export our capital and so on and so forth. But and we have control of the resources in different countries, but we help them to build infrastructure, build bridges, and so that everybody can profit from that. So that's their argument, the trickle down argument and many others. So why do you think the liberals or mainstream academics do not see imperialism in the Western Hemisphere? And yeah, is it because the maybe we are going back in time, and maybe imperialism is now aggressive and militarized as it used to be, but maybe in the 70s we saw maybe like the Fordism, the soft power, economic influence, and maybe it was not so obvious that this is imperialism, that this is a power structure. Yeah, what's your take on that?
Um, yes, it's true that mainstream academics do not even believe in the concept of imperialism at all. As I alluded to earlier, they believe that it's through exchange that countries are benefiting mutually, that this is a concept that is rooted in the whole notion of comparative advantage that Ricardo had advanced. And I don't think things have changed very much from Ricardo's perspective on the basis of comparative advantage in terms of how countries and businesses in various countries believe that they are able to seize on the specific attributes of a particular economy that they're in and engage in trade. Well, in fact, actually, Britain, when it rose to its position as the major imperial power, let's say in the early 19th century into the mid 19th century, that it in fact engaged in very serious forms of protectionism in which they did not trade with countries of the global south. I mean, India is one of the most important examples in which India was fairly prosperous in the 18th century. And by the 19th century, through British imperialism, the major product and products of India were excluded from the market of Britain, where you had the highest wage workers and the highest wage consumers. The protectionism was for the purpose of defending the economies of rich countries. And that, in fact, protectionism is something that continues throughout history under capitalism, as is advanced by a number of political economists, in the sense that no country can advance itself initially without having a degree to which it is able to dominate markets. And in the 19th century, the British market was one of the most advanced, superseded by the United States thereafter. And so just to answer your question, there wasn't a exchange that was based on equality. It was through theft and to a large extent and through the subordination, military subordination, uh, political subordination of places like India and China, in which Britain was able to gain their so-called comparative advantage. So that in some respects, comparative advantage is not necessarily the major starting point in terms of trade and so forth, but it is actually protectionism and the ability to militarily engage in conquest over countries, as happened in India and China and elsewhere. Actually, Karl Marx writes about this in his works in Capital itself, where he discusses the imperialist period and then the capitalist period in which these imperialist countries are able to even further advance their political and geostrategic interests, especially economic interests. So when you talk about soft power and you talk about the idea of exchange between different countries, well, there's a high level of unevenness within this process. And if we take a look at the history of, let's say, the United States, the kind of trade that it's engaged in, the kind of political power that it's um, advanced, and also the military domination that it had over the last, well, over almost a century, was used as a means to dominate over countries. So if we were to look at a continent such as Africa, well, to a large extent, I mean, there's no question about it. No one would actually, even mainstream scholars would not actually question this, that, Cecil Rhodes was a British capitalist who invested in infrastructure in Africa and sought to build a imperial hub in South Africa that would stretch all the way to the Nile. And in fact, he accomplished some of those goals, in the sense that you had British influence from South Africa all the way to almost Central Africa on the borders of what is now the Congo. So now today, the United States does not in any way engage in the kind of, and I would say the West as a whole, a kind of trade in which countries have an equal stake and an equal opportunity to advance themselves. Because one of the most important things that any country in the global South, poor countries, what I would call them, requires is technology. Without technology, they are really at the mercy of very rich countries and imperialist countries. And they're through the mercy, at the mercy of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and other international institutions that are able to apply specific kinds of penalties on countries that do not repay loans that have high usury rates. So if we were to take a look at the rates of interest that are charged by these Western banks and institutions, they are far higher than, for instance, China's degree to which it actually, in fact, engages in trade and in some ways invests, but does not actually, if it were to lend money to countries of the global South, it would not engage in the kinds of extreme profit making that is taking place in the West. So there isn't an equivalence between that. In fact, just the other day, China said that it would forgive almost all its loans in Africa. That's a very different kind of policy than is advanced by the West. And I would situate imperialism in the West, actually, amongst Western countries. You did mention something about soft power. Are you referring to, for instance, the National Endowment for Democracy or NGOs that are put into place by US government and European government agencies to help develop these countries? I think there's a degree to which, well, I mean, that there is some interest in trying to assist people from a private perspective, not from a government perspective of trying to advance equality on an international basis. But the US and Western powers always hold the cards, the monetary power to withdraw these benefits. And I think we found that with respect to the question of retroviral uh, immunity medication for HIV/AIDS, in which much of Africa and other parts of the world as well depend. And that under the current Trump administration, that money has been essentially withdrawn, which is leading to a potential crisis in Africa where there is a propensity to have higher levels of HIV incidence. So, I think that to a great degree, um, there was some benefit to these efforts to minimize uh, poverty and improve people's lives through increasing their longevity, reducing infant mortality rates, and so forth. But as you pointed out very well, they were really part of a soft power operation. And if you really look at some of the research on who actually contributes, going back to the 1960s, they tend to be corporate foundations, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and now foundations such as the Gates Foundation. And we can go on and on with respect to that, the Clinton Initiative and so forth, so that you have private sectors uh, domination over these kinds of extremely important forms of inoculation, just to give you one example, but one can go into others as well.
Absolutely, and maybe to underline also your argument and also hard power and soft power. For example, the US dollar is the world reserve currency, so much of the oil and other resources, important resources for the economy, are traded in US dollars. And it's almost like it's forbidden, so to speak, to trade in other currencies. And we saw that. Maybe we can see from the hard power perspective, the US has the most military bases around the whole world. No other country implements such a military dominance or military might and power in the whole world. And maybe there was no imperial power that ever reached this hegemony and this power. Maybe one can argue. And we see this also in military spending. The US is the leading nation. And in regard to soft power, we see the cultural hegemony, like Hollywood, like Starbucks, like McDonald's, that is everywhere in every small island in the whole world, basically. We see that, and you mentioned it already, for example, inequality in regard to, for example, voting rights in large international and institutions like World Bank, IMF, International Monetary Fund, and many others. So we see there is a disbalance. Also, one can see the technological dominance, like satellites, telecommunication, and who controls it. For example, Silicon Valley, and who controls social media networks. Where are the most servers and located, and the list goes on and on and on. If we see the history of unilateral geopolitical decisions, violation of human rights and international law, like for example, if one asks the question, where are the most people in prison, in comparison to the whole population, if we compare China and the US, this is awesome. And the list goes on and on. We can talk about the history of regime changes and many. This is the prime example of interfering in foreign countries and politics. And yeah, so I just wanted to underline your point. I believe this is clear.
Agree.
And
You want me to comment? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, feel free.
Oh, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. In fact, the last point you made with comparing the United States with China on the question of human rights, the United States tries to place itself at the pinnacle of human rights, yet at the same time, domestically, it has very cruel systems of imprisonment, of various forms of corporal, well, in this case, a punishment that's based on the death penalty and so forth. It has it subordinates its racial minorities to a white dominant population, European of European origin. And even in foreign policy, especially today, the whole notion of rule of law, we find the hypocrisy in this whole concept that the rule of law only applies to countries that the United States is interested in attacking or diminishing. And we see the examples of sanctions as a very cruel policy toward countries, especially poor countries in the world, who are just trying to survive. And one of the best examples would be Cuba, which remains a strong socialist state with a revolutionary people. There's a very good book on this topic that I would recommend that people read by Helen Yaffe at the University of Glasgow. For instance, Cuba has not only been the object of a blockade for, well, over 65 years, but also is now subjected to what is referred to as a state sponsor of terrorism, in which there's absolutely no truth to that. In fact, the United States is the space, in many ways, the state sponsor of terrorism in its alliance with the Israelis in the genocide that's going on right now against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So, for instance, rule of law counts in certain places, and in other places it doesn't. This work has been advanced by many scholars from the global south and the third world, showing the hypocrisy. In fact, if we take a look at the International Criminal Court, it was highly, I guess, interesting that the International Criminal Court brought the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as their defense minister, to under trial, in which, of course, they haven't been arrested. Meanwhile, the Palestinian members of Hamas have been actually killed by the Israelis in conflict. But I would just say that if we take a look at most of the organizations around the world that are based in the UN, United Nations, which is supposed to be the most important international organization that tries to create some kind of equality around the world on all bases, and also a certain level of rights that are based on states, and tries to reduce the level of conflict on a global basis, that the United States is not party to most of the accords that have been advanced by the agencies of the United Nations. And I can give you just a few examples. The International Labor Organization, which has many resolutions that have been passed by most countries of the world, have not been accepted by the United States. In fact, if you compare the United States with the People's Republic of China, there isn't any comparison, because the United States essentially does not support most of these ILO, International Labor Organization, resolutions, whereas China does. The right to organize, the right to self-expression, and so forth on the job. Americans do not have that right. And so I think this is one of the contradictions in this whole notion of the interpretation of what the rule of law really is basically for the United States whatever advances their interests.
Absolutely, and maybe I can make a bridge now to the current political situation also in the United States, as I interpret things. For example, as we see the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, and the whole libertarians and conservatives and right wings that are under this label, they tried to make a new isolationism, that we are not interfering again in different countries. These forever wars and endless wars, we want to stop them. We want to bring our soldiers home. We don't want the military spending is crumbling our economy. So we want to, build our own industry and we focus on ourselves. And as we can see also that Trump promised peace. He wanted to, have a Nobel Peace Prize and, like invent himself as a peacemaker and deal maker. And as we saw, he violated international law once again and invaded Iran, for example. And also,
Yes.
this brought tensions in this MAGA movement that made him president. For example, the CIA director Tulsi Gabbard, Steve Bannon, and for example also in the media, the Tucker Carlson also discussed it, and so many of his own movement are not how to speak are not happy with this involvement that the US again wants to be an empire. So we see this contradiction in the US. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the point you're trying to make, I do agree with that. There are different fractions of the capitalist class, some that are more internationally based, that want to see global trade. And I do think it's based on nation states that have multinational companies that want to go global, as opposed to the concept of a kind of indistinct global capitalist class, which I don't think is actually true. I think you need a state to have a global capitalist class that will defend their interests. But I completely agree with you on the point that there is notwithstanding what Trump has argued, he has advanced American imperialist interests. Well, he's tried to advance American imperialist interests. Maybe there will be blowback as there was in Iran, in which, forgive me, Iraq, where the U.S. war that was put forward by George W. Bush on false pretenses that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction was in fact a blowback against the Americans because it empowered a dominant population that was suppressed to a great degree, and that would be the Shia Muslims in Iraq, and it actually increased Iranian power and so forth, which is an example of that. At the same time, killing, between all these states, well over 1 million people. Even under the Clinton administration, which followed the George H.W. Bush administration, there was a tremendous amount of uh, sanctions that were imposed on Iraq, which apparently killed 500,000 children. And there's that famous refrain by the U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who was asked on a U.S. news channel, I think it's 60 Minutes CBS News. She was asked, well, was it really worth killing 500,000 children or being responsible for that in order to advance U.S. imperial interests? I mean, they didn't say it in that way, advance U.S. interests. And she said, yes, I think it was worth it. I mean, you can just go on the internet and find that. Um, yeah, I think one point I would say is that, yes, there are different tendencies, but I think that we're still seeing imperialism that is being propagated by the United States, only in a different form. So, as you were pointing out earlier, there was a degree to which there was greater levels of soft power. So, for instance, USAID was purportedly interested in helping people with respect to healthcare, helping women's rights or advancing women's rights, the rights of migrants, etc. They did to some extent, I don't think in any great way. They were primarily there to destabilized governments that the United States opposed, but that notwithstanding, there was some benefit to it. And certain people actually believe that it was a good thing to do. I think it is to advance women's rights. But when you look at a place like Afghanistan, it was we all, I think, support women's rights to be equal to men. Of course, we're different. I mean, there's a difference between men and women. Uh, but in Afghanistan, it only applied to people in the city of Kabul, and a very small proportion of the population. And at the, when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, it showed you the degree to which women did not really matter in the equations of the Biden administration. So, I do think that, yeah, there are efforts to do good, but I think behind that is to gain a imperialist foothold into these various regions of the world that they consider important to undermine uh, potential opponents. For instance, the Russian Federation. There's no question about it. The People's Republic of China, in terms of actually specious examples of human rights violations, where there is evidence that they are not taking place, for instance, in Xinjiang province. Absolute evidence that any scholar will show you, but yet the propaganda is completely the opposite. And it remains so, actually, because the United States continues to advance these arguments as they did in Tibet and so forth and so on, which are really these political, geographic or geopolitical boundaries that were drawn by the British in the early 20th century. Um, and they don't reflect the populations that live on either side of the boundary between India and China and other parts of the world. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of points that we can actually discuss with respect to this point. The McMahon line I'm referring to with respect to Britain in the early 19th century, drawing a arbitrary line that increased the size of India, the colonial Indian state, and diminished the size of China when it was uh, under the Qing dynasty and also becoming more and more impoverished. Uh, so, we're seeing things come back again today in many ways by the U.S. efforts as the imperial power to, uh, people argue, uh, break Russia up into many different statelets. You've heard that argument before, or to perhaps do the same thing to China, as we're seeing with respect to policies that the U.S. is advancing. And also the militarism that goes along with it and the rhetoric of militarism that we see. United States plans to go to war X year. I remember the first time I heard it was 2025. They were planning to go to war against China over Taiwan, which is a territory of China, arguably. Whereas now it's 2027. There's all these predictions by these militarists that only, as you were pointing out earlier, increase military spending. Um, and that's actually, one point I would make is that increased military spending, uh, the left and liberals, I think, get it wrong in some respect that actually advances the power of the United States as opposed to diminishing it. I mean, it's a very sad fact, but it allows the United States to expand its political and military influence, as you're pointing out again on the question of bases. There are 800 bases that the United States maintains around the world, some of which are being taken away, for instance, in the Sahel region of Africa, where you're seeing the French and the Americans being kicked out. And but at the same time, because they're not supported and they're considered to be agents of American or European domination. But that's what I would say in terms of military power. that the United States is exerting and having an influence on its economic power and the ability to enforce unequal exchange on a global level through military means.
Absolutely, and maybe I can also underline your argument by referring to two historical events, and maybe history haunts us even nowadays. We can see it. The Chinese government and officials often refer to the and remind us of the century of the great humiliation, the opium wars, and it seems like that they learned their lesson and they are more cautious about sovereignty, about having a power and protecting themselves. It seems like, and also we can see that the history haunts us again. In regard to the Middle East, we did draw the line, wherever it fits us and our interests. We see it in regard to the secret agreement. Back then it was secret, the Sykes-Picot agreement, and then afterwards it came up to the public, I believe, from the Soviet Union, and so
Yes.
yeah. So history haunts us, it seems.
Definitely, I think that's absolutely correct interpretation of historical events and how they impact on the present. One thing I'd say about China is that my observation would be is that they're generally a peaceful country that sees itself under threat, as you were saying, the century of humiliation from actually the 19th century to the mid 20th century, and how they don't want to see that happen again. Yet at the same time, we're talking about a people that have been around as a distinct people for over 4,000 years. And, we can make the case that, China is increasing their military budget because of warmongering, I think, by the West. Uh, Yet at the same time, they feel they haven't engaged in war to any great degree, I mean, the only example over the last 4 decades was a 1 week incursion into Vietnam, where they actually ceded that territory over a question with respect to Cambodia. But the one thing I would say again is that, kind of reinforce it, is that the Chinese feel comfortable in their shoes. They don't feel like they have to advance their uh, kind of imperialistic interest because they know these are people who know who they are. They have histories and customs that go back um, millennia, as opposed to, even Europe and certainly the United States, where we're talking about several hundred years in the United States, and maybe 1,000 or more years after the Roman Empire collapsed. So or even less. So I think that there's a tremendous difference if we take a look at peoples of especially East Asia and the peoples who live in other parts of the world where there's been colonization, for instance, the United States, which is very militaristic, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, but also the Israeli project that you have a highly militaristic state. I think primarily because there's a lack of legitimacy for these people who are in many instances, not primarily, but was established by European jury on false pretenses, and yeah, and it was hidden for I would say decades, since the 1940s. People did not know the real origins of the Israeli state, which is a settler colony, settler colonial state that was propped up and is being propped up by the United States. In fact, now we're talking about, if you read some of the social media, the Israelis American state or the American Israeli state, where people don't know which country controls the other because of the tremendous influence of the um, Zionist lobby in the United States.
I believe, scholars like Ilan Pappé, the great historian, Judith Butler, Norman Finkelstein, and many, many other Jewish and Israeli scholars would agree and with you on your assessment. I wanted to mention that as we have many listeners, leave your comment and ask your question to Professor Ness. I will put it forward, so just type in the chat. Feel free also to subscribe. And as you mentioned, the rise of China, and as we spoke about, China, I wanted to ask you also about the multipolar world order, because many analysts and scholars are now referring to that concept, and they are talking about a new rising or multipolar world order. And here is the question: did we witness it? Is it true? Do we live in a multipolar world order, or is it still that the US is dominating the global affairs? And maybe the second question or the follow-up question would be, is multipolarity a new phenomenon which challenged the Western hegemony or the US world order? Or is it, or so to speak, is it an inner imperial fight for hegemony, so to speak? Or on the other hand, do we see democratic progressive elements, or is it mistaken to think that the multipolar bloc, for example, the BRICS, that they are united? There are many differences and even conflicts between India and China. Also, with the other nations that are involved, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and many others. So, what's your take on that? How can we understand the multipolar world order? Is it existent, or is it rising? Is it in the coming? Or and is it for the good or for the bad? Is it a new empire? All of these questions are important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I think you ask different people, you get a different answer. In my view, there's no question that the BRICS represent a far more powerful bloc than at any time since the rise of the U.S. as the major imperial power, primarily because of its unification of many countries. Now, the question is whether they can hold together. The question of whether they can hold together is up in the air. For instance, we had other instances throughout the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years, something like that, where you had the Group of 77, and before that, actually 70 years ago, the Bandung Conference that brought into existence the non-aligned movement, which was supposed to be an alternative bloc. I think there is an aspiration amongst the people of the world to have some kind of alternative to the dominance of the United States and its partners that would give a certain right to advance their interests. So, for instance, I believe very strongly that the era of independence between 1945 and, let's say, 1975 was largely not really very effective in advancing the rights of people in the global South, and advanced because the system was dominated by the United States and then it's a European and East Asian ally, Japan. So then I would make the case that in addition to that, economically, as you were pointing out earlier, the dollar is the currency of trade, and it remains so. There are efforts to create alternative currencies, and of course, there's a basket of five major currencies. But I think the U.S. and Trump said he would go to war over that issue if the United States were not able to maintain that. And I'm still of the belief that the United States is the most powerful military power in the world. Now, I don't say this in a positive way. I think it's a very dangerous phenomenon, especially when you have reckless people like Donald Trump running a country, the United States. And Yeah, so I think that's problematic. So the idea of a counter-hegemonic bloc is a very one that we would all like to see, primarily because you want to give credence to the aspirations of the vast majority of the world, some 90% of the world who live in poor countries or in the global south or emerging economies and so forth. Um, and they never really were able to achieve that through independence. So I think that when we take a look at governments that we may disagree with, or people might have differences of opinion with because they are doing things that we disagree with, you could make that case for just about any country. I don't think the BRICS are dominating their regions that they're in a example of sub-imperialism, that the notion that was put forward by Roy Mauro Marini. What he was concerned with was the notion of sub-imperialism that the United States engaged in, and the West through creating comprador leaders in each of the countries, suppressing any social movement for equality and change to improve the lives of peasants and workers, uh, suppressing them in every way possible, can continue to do that. And we don't see that happening amongst countries in the BRICS bloc for the most part. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. I'm not a purist, and I don't think any of us should be because we live in a real world where there are contradictions.
Absolutely. As I saw a question in the chat, what is his opinion on Germany? I would add maybe some details. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, for example, stated that Israel is doing the dirty work for us. So he, for example, was very glad and honored even that Israel is violating international law. Then also he stated that he want to make Germany the biggest military might in Europe. The last one that said this, we know about him. And then also it's worth to mention that Germany and Austria now, I believe yesterday or the day before, blocked in the European Union the efforts of many countries to imply sanctions on Israel in regard to violation of human rights, in violation of international law, in regard to West Bank. And Germany once again, blocked this effort. So yeah, maybe this I wanted to add about Germany. And yeah, what's your take on Germany and the current situation?
I'm going to say this, maybe I don't mean to offend anybody, but I think that the current generations that are living in Germany bear no responsibility for what Germany did in the past. And German people are as uh, important and as any other people in the world, as far as I'm concerned. I think there's a certain degree to which they're being used and manipulated by the United States and Israel to, give them some kind of complex that what happened in the Second World War, which we should not diminish by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, I think what Mertz said was really a reflection of what the Israelis want to hear. And this whole notion of guilt, collective guilt, which I disagree with. We're talking about people who were not alive during the Second World War, no less, not even kids. I mean, at most children. So they have no responsibility whatsoever. Yet Germans maintain this complex, I would say, that they're responsible. Yeah, I mean, they are responsible because of their past generations. I don't agree with that. I don't subscribe to that notion at all. I think that we have to take a look at history and the possibility that any people can engage in horrific acts of genocide and brutality. And none of them are the same or equivalent, but when we notice a genocide, we can certainly say it's there. So, yeah, I think it's quite horrible that Mertz would say such a thing about the Israelis, which I guess he was being honest to some degree, or yeah, I guess especially in light of, what happened in 2015 and the great migration that took place, and the growth of the AfD and other right-wing movements that are growing in popularity in not just Eastern Europe and Central Europe, but Western Europe as well. So yeah, I mean, I could say something. I think that there is a tremendous amount of admiration for the Israelis amongst European leaders because of their militarism, and that they do things that perhaps the West would not do or other European countries would not do. However, at the same time, they're supporting a genocide that's taking place right now. I mean, one can say the same thing for Britain under Keir Starmer, um, yeah, amongst
But
other countries.
but I would slightly disagree. I would even argue that it makes the argument more powerful if we are responsible for the Holocaust even today, and if we take our responsibility serious, then it's even more, horrific that we see what is going on, the humanitarian crisis and so on and so forth, the violation of international law, the blockade of humanitarian aid, the settler movement, the illegal in the West Bank. So in regard to our history, it is our responsibility that these things do not happen again, never again.
That,
This is the slogan, never again. So if we take our lessons seriously, then this makes the argument even stronger, I believe. Then Germany
yeah,
should protect, minorities and ethnic groups
exactly.
and vulnerable
Great.
people around the world. And so, yeah.
Take that. Yeah, I agree completely, and I take that corrective seriously. I completely agree with you.
So yeah, maybe it's late where you are. So I appreciate very much your time. I know that yeah, you stayed up late for this live interview. Maybe to my last question, because it's also a key pillar to your work, and I want just to brief mention it, and maybe in the next episode, maybe also if we get Radhika Desai, uh, who is now in Shanghai, and maybe she has problems with the internet. But maybe I want to have a discussion about, she coined it geopolitical economy, and you coined it, or you work with the concept of political economy. So maybe we can just touch upon the concept, what is a political economy, and what are the key concepts? How can we understand power structures better? Why is it that the political sphere is interconnected with the economic sphere? Just some sentences just to have it mentioned, and yeah, maybe in the next episode we can go deeper also with Radhika.
I think there are a lot of points of agreement that I have with Radhika. There's no question about it. On her perspective of geopolitical economy, and that it is crucial. And I think political economy is the overall notion. I mean, concept that geopolitical economy rests within. But to say one is engaged in political economy, I think reveals the fact that there is a relationship between for me, it would be the state and state power and the um, state of the people in that country and the entire world, depending on which country it is. So, and I mean, I think there are many different, one has to be very specific about what, in this case, I have to be very specific about what I'm discussing, and I'd rather go into specifics about places where I could give examples of political economy. I mean, there's no question, and I agree with Veronica, that there is a resistance that is occurring in the world that is fundamentally different from 10 years ago, where we are seeing um, a fight back amongst countries that are under the grip of imperialism, economic imperialism, military imperialism, and you mentioned earlier cultural imperialism. I mean, this whole notion of social capital, I think, is really another example of cultural imperialism, where the ideas, the culture, etc., as you're saying, McDonald's, the restaurant, whatever people do in the West is supposed to be somehow better than what people do in other parts of the world, which is, completely, I think, a form of imperialism, obviously in itself, the social imperialism. Um, I thought that was a very good point you made earlier. And I think we can give examples throughout the world on that. And I think it's, once again, very important to be specific about what we're talking about. And then going from the uh, particular to the universal, I think is the best way to handle it, inductively as opposed to deductively.
Dear Professor Ness, I thank you very much that you stayed up so late and that you agreed and that you take your time to talk with me about all these important topics. Yes, I'm glad and honored that you followed my invitation for this talk, and yeah, I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
I'm happy I stayed up to speak with you, and I'm, happy, you can give people my email if they